The coffee was bitter, institutional, the kind that had been sitting on the burner for 3 hours too long. Major General Vincent Harlow stood in line at the forward operating base Cyprus mess hall wearing the faded utilities of a supply sergeant. No rank insignia, no name tape, just another tired face in a sea of exhausted personnel rotating through the grinder of Operation Persistent Watch. He'd flown in on a cargo transport 12 hours earlier, landing under cover of darkness on a strip carved into the Syrian desert, and no one knew who he was. That was the point. The Inspector General's office had received 17 formal complaints in 6 months. Morale issues, leadership failures, a combat aviation brigade that had somehow lost its edge despite being staffed with some of the most decorated pilots in the command. Harlow needed to see it raw, unfiltered, before brass and protocol smoothed over the cracks. So here he stood, tray in hand, waiting for powdered eggs and whatever passed for bacon in a forward deployment. The private ahead of him was young, maybe 22, with the hollow-eyed stare of someone pulling 18-hour shifts. She grabbed her tray mechanically, barely looking at the food. Behind her, two warrant officers were talking in low voices, and Harlow's trained ear caught fragments. What they expect when they give her the graveyard. Setting her up to fail. Ghostwalk doesn't deserve this. That call sign, Ghostwalk. Harlow knew it, had seen it in after-action reports, always attached to successful missions completed under impossible conditions. Intelligence intercepts, high-value target extractions, the kind of flying that required surgical precision in hostile airspace. But there was something else, something the official reports never captured. The tone when people said it, like respect mixed with something darker. "You gonna move, Sergeant?" Harlow blinked. The private was staring at him, tired irritation in her eyes. He mumbled an apology, stepped forward, took his tray. As he turned to find a seat, he heard one of the warrant officers mutter something about the new meat and laugh. Not at him, at someone else. He sat alone at a corner table and watched the room. 15 minutes later, she walked in. He knew immediately. Not from any physical description. He hadn't been briefed on appearance. But from the way conversation in the mess hall didn't stop, didn't pause, just changed, became performative. Captain Raina Cahill moved through the space like someone who'd learned to take up as little of it as possible, and Harlow watched as 3 different groups of pilots suddenly found their phones fascinating. She sat alone, 2 tables away from everyone else. Harlow studied her profile while pretending to focus on his food. Polynesian heritage, strong features, the kind of quiet competence that came from 1,000 hours in the cockpit. She ate quickly, methodically, and was almost finished when a young lieutenant approached her table. "Captain Cahill." The lieutenant's voice carried that careful tone junior officers used when following orders they disagreed with. "Colonel Vickers wants to see you at 0600. Flight line. He said bring your logbook." Raina didn't look up from her tray, just nodded once. The lieutenant hesitated, seemed about to say something else, then walked away. She was gone 90 seconds later, tray bust, no conversation, no lingering. Harlow watched her disappear through the exit and saw the warrant officers from earlier exchange a look. One shook his head slowly. The gesture contained volumes. Harlow stood, dumped his tray, and made his way to the operations center. He needed to understand what was happening to Captain Raina Ghostwalk Cahill before his inspection became official. Because in his 28 years of service, he'd learned one unchanging truth. When a decorated pilot ate alone in a combat zone, something had gone catastrophically wrong with leadership. The ops center was a converted shipping container, climate-controlled and packed with computers, radios, and display screens showing real-time feeds from across the theater. Harlow badged in using his false credentials. The tech sergeant manning the desk barely glanced at him and found a terminal in the back corner. The supply sergeant persona gave him access to logistics databases, but more importantly, it gave him invisibility. People talked freely around supply personnel. He pulled up flight schedules first. Ghostwalk was listed for a reconnaissance mission, Wheels up at 07:30. The tasking seemed routine on paper. Visual confirmation of suspected weapons caches along the Euphrates corridor, standard loiter pattern, 2-hour sortie. But the aircraft assignment made him pause. She was flying the oldest MQ-9 Reaper drone in the unit, tail number ending in 037, the same bird that had been deadlined for maintenance issues twice in the past month. They're really gonna make her take that piece of shit. A voice behind Harlow made him turn slightly. Two NCOs were looking at a different screen, shaking their heads. Vickers doesn't care, the other replied. He wants her to fail. This is his 4th try. What she got? 9 successful missions in a row. 11. She keeps pulling off miracles and it's making him look bad. So he gives her the worst equipment, the worst time slots, and waits for Murphy's Law to catch up. Harlow's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral, his body language uninterested. The NCOs moved on, their conversation shifting to mundane logistics concerns. He returned to the screen and started pulling records, building a picture that grew more troubling with each file. Raina Cahill had enlisted at 19, spent 6 years as an Army helicopter mechanic before being selected for warrant officer flight training, transitioned to the Air Force through an inter-service transfer program, and completed pilot training in the top 5% of her class. 3 deployments, 2 distinguished flying crosses, a Silver Star for a mission in Afghanistan that had gone kinetic when her surveillance flight had intercepted a distress call from a besieged Marine unit. She'd kept station for 7 hours, coordinating close air support with every available asset, personally guiding in strikes that saved 43 lives. Her performance reviews were immaculate until 6 months ago. That's when Colonel Harrison Vickers took command of the brigade. The change in her evaluation reports was immediate and damning. Suddenly Ghostwalk was minimally effective, showed poor judgment, needed significant improvement in crew coordination. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so obviously deliberate. The actual mission reports told a different story. Successful completion rates that exceeded unit standards, 0 incidents, consistent positive feedback from ground commanders she'd supported. Someone was building a paper trail to end her career. Harlow minimized the screen and leaned back, processing. This kind of targeted harassment wasn't just unprofessional, it was a cancer that destroyed unit cohesion. But he needed more than records. He needed to see it, hear it, understand the mechanism. He checked his watch. Just after 0300. Flight ops would begin crew briefs in 2 hours. He could position himself near the ready room, continue the observation. As he stood to leave, he caught sight of movement on one of the external camera feeds. A figure on the flight line, alone in the darkness, walking the perimeter of the drone operations shelter. Even in the grainy night vision footage, he recognized Ghostwalk's silhouette. She moved from aircraft to aircraft, pausing at each one, and Harlow realized she was conducting her own pre-flight inspections 3 hours before her scheduled brief. She didn't trust the maintenance reports. Smart, he thought, and heartbreaking. The sky was beginning to lighten when Harlow positioned himself outside the operations briefing room, ostensibly checking inventory on a clipboard he'd borrowed from the supply office. The hall was quiet, the base still shaking off sleep. Through the partially open door, he could hear voices. Colonel Vickers was holding court, 3 other pilots in attendance. "Look, I'm not saying she's a bad pilot," Vickers was saying, his tone suggesting he absolutely was saying that. "I'm saying she's had an unusual string of luck, and luck runs out, especially when you're flying gear that's held together with duct tape and prayers." One of the pilots, a Major Harlow didn't recognize, spoke up carefully. "Sir, with respect, Ghostwalk's mission success rate is documented. The equipment issues aren't on her." "The equipment issues," Vickers snapped, "are because she pushes the platforms beyond design specifications. She hot dogs, takes unnecessary risks, and then acts surprised when systems fail. Today's flight is going to be by the book. If she can't complete a simple reconnaissance run without drama, Maybe it's time to reconsider her position. The room went quiet. Harlow heard a chair scrape. "Buy the book with 037, sir." Another voice, younger, angry. "That bird's been flagged for electrical problems. She'll be lucky if the camera feed stays stable." "Then she'll adapt. That's what good pilots do. Brief starts in 10 minutes. Make sure Cahill knows I expect her here on time." Dismissed. The pilots filed out, their faces carefully neutral. Harlow watched them go, each one avoiding eye contact with anyone else. The major from earlier paused in the hallway, pulled out his phone, typed something quickly. Harlow couldn't see the message, but he saw the recipient's name, Ghostwalk. She arrived at exactly 05:58, 2 minutes early, carrying a worn leather flight bag and a tablet. Her flight suit was immaculate, her bearing professional, but Harlow noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes swept the room before entering. Threat assessment. Constant awareness. He'd seen it before in soldiers who'd learned their real enemies wore the same uniform. The brief lasted 23 minutes. Harlow listened from his position in the hallway, cataloging every slight, every subtle dig. Vickers questioned her route planning, her fuel calculations, her communication protocols. Each question phrased as concern, each answer she gave dismissed with faint condescension. The other pilots remained silent, witnesses to an execution. When it ended, Ghostwalk was first out the door. She didn't look left or right, just headed straight for the flight line. Harlow gave her a 30-second head start, then followed at a distance. The drone operations shelter was a climate-controlled hangar housing the ground control stations. Aircraft 037 sat on the tarmac outside, its gray paint faded and patched, sensor turret showing the wear of hundreds of combat hours. A maintenance tech was signing off the final inspection when Ghostwalk arrived. Their conversation was brief, the tech handing her the clipboard with an expression that looked like an apology. Harlow watched as she conducted her walk-around, hands moving over access panels and antennas with practiced efficiency. She spent extra time at the avionics bay, removed the cover, inspected connections with a flashlight. When she closed it up, she paused, one hand resting on the fuselage, and Harlow saw her take a long, slow breath. Then she headed inside to the control station. He waited 5 minutes before following, entering the shelter through a side door marked for authorized personnel. His fake credentials got him through without challenge. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, the walls lined with control stations where pilots flew drones thousands of miles away. Most stations were dark, but 3 were active, their screens glowing with pre-dawn reconnaissance footage. Ghostwalk Station was at the far end. She sat alone in the dim light, running pre-flight checks, her fingers moving across controls with balletic precision. Harlow found a shadowed corner where he could observe without being obvious, pretending to inventory equipment stored against the wall. The mission launch was flawless. At 07:28, aircraft 037's engine spooled up on the external speakers. At 07:30, Ghostwalk's voice came through calm and clear. "Tower, Ghostwalk, ready for departure." Ghostwalk Tower, winds light and variable, cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Cleared for takeoff, 27, Ghostwalk. Harlow watched the takeoff camera feed. The Reaper accelerated down the runway, lifted smoothly, gear retracting as it climbed into the pale morning sky. Then, 3 minutes into the flight, the electrical problems began. It started with the primary flight display flickering just once, barely noticeable. Ghostwalk's hands moved immediately, switching to backup systems. Her voice on the radio remained steady. "Tower, Ghostwalk, experiencing intermittent avionics. Continuing mission monitoring systems." "Copy, Ghostwalk. Advise if you need to return to base." "Negative at this time. Systems stable on backup." But Harlow could see they weren't stable. The camera feed was degrading, pixelating in random patterns. The targeting pod, the Reaper's primary reconnaissance tool, was showing data dropouts every 20 to 30 seconds. Any other pilot would have already turned back, called the mission a scrub, landed safely, and let maintenance deal with it. Ghostwalk kept flying. She adjusted her flight path to compensate for the camera issues, used the periods of stable feed to capture the required imagery, narrated her observations into the mission recorder with clinical precision. Harlow found himself leaning forward, fascinated despite himself. She was improvising in real time, adapting to cascading failures with the kind of creativity that couldn't be taught. Tower Ghostwalk primary navigation degraded, switching to GPS backup, continuing to waypoint 3. A new voice cut in, Colonel Vickers watching from somewhere else in the operations center. Ghostwalk actual, consider returning to base. We can retask the mission. There was a pause just a heartbeat long. When Ghostwalk responded, her tone was perfectly respectful, perfectly professional. Actual Ghostwalk, mission is 60% complete. All essential systems functional. Request permission to continue. Another pause, longer this time. Harlow could feel the tension through the radio silence. Vickers was hoping she'd fail, needed her to fail, but couldn't directly order her to abort without looking like the villain he was. Ghostwalk actual, continue. But if you lose any additional systems, you abort immediately. Understood. Understood, sir. Ghostwalk continuing. The mission stretched from 2 hours to 3. System failures multiplied. The secondary flight display went dark. The autopilot disengaged. The communication radio developed a static-filled crackle that made every transmission an effort. Through it all, Ghostwalk flew manually, compensated, adapted, and completed every single tasking requirement. Her voice never wavered, never showed stress, never gave Vickers the satisfaction of hearing her rattled. Harlow had seen combat pilots crack under less pressure. He'd seen seasoned aviators make mistakes that killed people when faced with equipment failures in hostile territory. Ghostwalk was flying a crippled drone through contested airspace where enemy air defenses could light up at any moment, and she was doing it with the kind of steady competence that made it look easy. It wasn't easy. Harlow could see the muscle tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set, the slight tremor in her hand when she reached for her water bottle during a brief stable moment. She was holding it together through sheer force of will, and everyone watching knew it. The landing was a masterpiece. With half her instruments dead and the flight control system glitching every 30 seconds, she brought 037 down onto the runway with a precision that would have been impressive in perfect conditions. The Reaper touched down gentle as a whisper, rolled out straight and true, and taxied to its parking spot like nothing had ever been wrong. Harlow heard someone in the operations center whisper, "Jesus Christ, how did she do that?" Ghostwalk didn't celebrate. She completed her post-flight checklist, secured the aircraft systems, and filed her mission report in the same calm, professional tone she'd maintained throughout. Then she stood, grabbed her flight bag, and walked out of the control station without looking at anyone. Harlow followed her outside. The sun was high now, the desert heat building toward its midday peak. She stopped about 50 meters from the shelter in the thin shade of a fuel truck and stood there with her back to the world. He saw her hands were shaking. She'd held it together through the entire mission, through the gauntlet of failures and the weight of knowing her commander wanted her to crash, wanted her to fail, wanted an excuse to end her career. And now, alone in the shade, her body was finally allowing itself to feel the stress. Harlow approached slowly, deliberately making noise so he wouldn't startle her. When he was 10 feet away, he spoke quietly. "That was some of the best flying I've seen in my career." She turned, and for the first time he saw her face clearly in daylight. Exhaustion, determination, and something else, a kind of resigned understanding that no amount of excellence would change what was happening to her. "Thanks," she said simply. "You're new." "Supply sergeant, rotated in last night." He paused, chose his words carefully. "I couldn't help but notice you eat alone in the mess hall." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. recognition of a fellow observer. People are busy, lots of missions, lots of stress. That's not why. She studied him for a long moment, weighing whether this conversation was worth having. Finally, she shrugged. No, that's not why, but it's the reason I give people who ask. Why don't you transfer, request reassignment? With your record, you could write your own ticket. Because that's what he wants. Colonel Vickers. He wants me gone, wants me to quit, wants to say that women can't handle the pressure. If I transfer, I prove him right. If I stay. She trailed off, looked back at the operations shelter. If I stay, eventually he'll find a way to make the paper trail stick. But at least I'll know I didn't run. That's not sustainable. No, she agreed. It's not, but it's where I am. Before Harlow could respond, his radio crackled. All fake personnel were being recalled for a surprise inspection. The general was apparently arriving 12 hours earlier than scheduled, and the base commander wanted everyone looking sharp. Raina heard it too. She carried a radio on her belt, and her expression shifted to something like grim amusement. Guess the supply sergeant better go make sure all the beans are counted, she said. Thanks for the conversation. Don't take this the wrong way, but I hope I don't see you in the mess hall. One person eating alone is sad. Two is a club nobody wants to join. She walked away before he could reply, heading toward the maintenance hangar where the tech crews were already swarming over 037. Harlow watched her go, then keyed his radio and confirmed he was heading back. He had 3 hours before his official arrival. 3 hours to decide how to handle what he'd witnessed. Because Captain Raina, Ghostwalk, Cahill was being systematically destroyed by her commanding officer, and everyone on this base knew it. The question was whether anyone would care enough to stop it before she broke. Harlow walked back toward the main administrative building, his mind already forming the plan. The surprise inspection would be thorough, public, and devastating to anyone who'd been abusing their authority. But he needed one more piece of evidence first. He needed to know why. Why was Colonel Vickers targeting her specifically? There was always a why. He found it in her personnel file, in a section he hadn't examined closely during his late-night research. 3 years ago, before Vickers took command, Ghostwalk had filed a formal complaint against a senior officer for sexual harassment. The complaint had been substantiated, investigated, and the officer had been quietly retired. That officer's name was Harrison Vickers, SR. Colonel Vickers wasn't just a bad leader. He was a son settling a score his father couldn't. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The targeted harassment, the impossible missions, the deliberate equipment failures, all designed to force out the woman who'd ended his father's career. And because he was doing it through official channels, through the veneer of legitimate command decisions, it was nearly impossible to prove. Nearly. Harlow pulled out his personal phone, the one that wasn't part of his cover identity, and made a call to the Inspector General's office. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, wheels were in motion that even a colonel couldn't stop. Then he went to prepare for his official arrival. Major General Vincent Harlow walked into Forward Operating Base Cyprus at exactly 1400 hours, in full dress uniform, 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders. The base commander met him at the helipad with appropriate ceremony, crisp salutes and nervous energy. Harlow returned the salute, kept his expression neutral, and said 3 words that made the base commander's face go pale. Assemble the brigade. Within 20 minutes, every available person on the base was formed up in the motor pool, standing in rough formation under the brutal afternoon sun. Harlow stood on a makeshift platform, 2 cargo pallets stacked and secured, and looked out at the faces. He found Ghostwalk in the second row, standing at attention, her expression unreadable. Colonel Vickers stood near the front with the other senior officers, his posture perfect, confidence radiating from every inch of his bearing. That confidence wouldn't last. "I'm going to tell you all a story," Harlow began, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. "Last night I ate dinner in your mess hall. I was dressed as a supply sergeant, no rank, no identification, just another tired body in uniform. I wanted to see this unit the way it really operates, not the sanitized version prepared for inspections, and what I saw troubled me deeply. He paused, let the words settle. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Vickers remained perfectly still. I saw a highly decorated combat pilot eating alone. I saw warrant officers talking in hushed voices about setting someone up to fail. I saw leadership that seemed more interested in destroying careers than building mission effectiveness. So I stayed undercover. I watched. I listened. And this morning, I observed one of the most impressive displays of airmanship I've witnessed in my career. Harlow's gaze found Ghostwalk again. She was looking straight ahead, but he saw the slight tension in her jaw. Captain Cahill, front and center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ghostwalk stepped out of formation and marched forward, her movements precise, controlled. She stopped 3 paces in front of the platform and saluted. Harlow returned it. At ease, Captain. I'm going to ask you some questions and I want honest answers. Understood? Yes, sir. This morning, you flew aircraft 037 on a reconnaissance mission. That aircraft had been flagged for maintenance issues. Did you know that before you flew? Yes, sir. Did you feel pressured to fly despite those issues? She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Harlow saw her calculating the cost of honesty. Finally, she squared her shoulders. Sir, I felt that returning to base would be viewed as a failure regardless of the legitimate technical problems. Who would view it that way? Another pause. My chain of command, sir. Be specific, Captain. Colonel Vickers, sir. The formation went silent. Harlow heard someone's radio squelch in the distance, a helicopter passing overhead. He let the moment breathe, let everyone understand what was happening. Colonel Vickers, you have a response. Vickers stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled. Sir, Captain Cahill is a competent pilot, but she has a tendency to interpret standard command decisions as personal attacks. The aircraft was certified for flight. The mission was within normal parameters. If she felt undue pressure, that's a perception issue, not a command climate issue. I see, Harlow nodded slowly. And the 17 other complaints I've received about command climate in this brigade, are those also perception issues? Vickers's composure cracked just slightly. Sir, I'm not aware. You're not aware because the complaints didn't go through you. They went to the IG. They described a pattern of harassment, favoritism, and retaliation. They painted a picture of a command that has lost its way. And everything I saw in the past 18 hours confirmed every single word. Harlow's voice hardened. Colonel Vickers, you are relieved of command, effective immediately. You will remain on this base under restriction while pending investigation. Major Reese, your acting commander until a replacement arrives. The Major Harlow had heard defending Ghostwalk earlier stepped forward, stunned. Sir, yes, sir. Harlow looked back at Ghostwalk, still standing at attention. Captain, you filed a harassment complaint 3 years ago that ended a senior officer's career. That officer was Colonel Vickers's father. Were you aware of that connection? Her eyes widened slightly. No, sir, no, sir. It's because it's not in the official records. Family connections are usually redacted from personnel files to prevent exactly what happened here. But I dug deeper. He turned back to address the entire formation. Let me be absolutely clear about something. This is what good order and discipline look like. When someone with power abuses it, they are held accountable. When someone does their job with excellence despite facing systematic attempts to destroy them, they are recognized and protected. Captain Cahill didn't just survive this morning's mission. She excelled. She demonstrated the kind of skill and composure that defines what it means to be an Air Force aviator. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small case. Inside was a medal, bronze and blue, the Air Force Commendation Medal. This won't erase what happened. It won't fix the months of harassment, but it will go in your official record as a counter to every false evaluation Colonel Vickers filed. And effective immediately, you're reassigned to the Inspector General's office as a special advisor on command climate issues. Someone needs to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. Ghostwalk stared at the medal, and for the first time since Harlow had watched her walk into that mess hall, he saw tears forming in her eyes. She blinked them back, fought for control, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Thank you, sir. Permission to address the formation." Harlow stepped aside. "Granted." She turned to face her fellow pilots, the people who'd watched her struggle alone for months. "I don't have a grand speech prepared. I just want you to know that I never blamed any of you for staying silent. Command climates like this trap everyone, not just the targets. But I also want you to know that speaking up matters. The complaints that reached the IG, the quiet words of support, the major who texted me before this morning's brief to tell me he had my back, those things kept me going. So thank you. And to anyone else dealing with something similar, don't quit. Don't let them win." The formation stayed silent, but Harlow saw nods, saw people looking at each other with new understanding. As Ghostwalk returned to her position, a single person started clapping, then another. Then the entire motor pool erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the containers and buildings surrounding them. Colonel Vickers stood frozen, his career ending in real time, his calculated cruelty finally meeting consequences. Later that evening, after the formation had dispersed and the immediate chaos of command transition had settled, Harlow found Ghostwalk sitting alone on the flight line, watching the sun set over the desert. He approached quietly, stood beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked. She smiled, a genuine one this time. "Still processing. This morning I thought I'd be filing transfer papers by the end of the month. Now I'm reassigned to the Pentagon, and apparently I'm some kind of poster child for speaking truth to power." "You earned it." "Did I, or did I just survive long enough for someone to notice?" She shook her head. "I'm grateful, sir. Don't misunderstand. But part of me keeps wondering how many others didn't survive, didn't get noticed, didn't have a general go undercover in their mess hall." "Too many," Harlow admitted. "That's why I need people like you in positions where they can change the system. The Inspector General's office isn't glamorous. You won't be flying combat missions, but you'll be protecting the people who do. And that's enough. It has to be." They stood in silence, watching the sky fade from gold to purple. Finally, Ghostwalk spoke again. "The 3 words, sir, the ones that made you freeze, what were they?" Harlow smiled at the memory. "You want to know what the private said in the mess hall? The thing that started this whole investigation. If you're willing to share." She said, "They're killing her." Didn't elaborate, didn't need to. I asked to, and she just looked toward your table and said, "Ghostwalk, they're killing her spirit one mission at a time." That's when I knew I couldn't just file a report from a distance. I had to see it myself. Raina was quiet for a long moment. "I need to find that private, thank her. Her name is Rivera, works supply. She'll probably be mortified that her comment sparked all this." "Good, we could use more people willing to be mortified in defense of what's right." Ghostwalk stood, dusted off her flight suit. "I should go pack. Apparently I'm supposed to report to Washington in 72 hours. "There's no rush. Take some time, decompress. The Air Force will still be broken when you get there." She laughed at that, the sound carrying across the empty flight line. "Thank you, sir, for everything, for seeing, for caring enough to do something about it." Harlow saluted her, and she returned it. As she walked away toward the living quarters, he remained on the flight line, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow he would continue his inspection, would document everything he'd found, would ensure that the systemic failures that had allowed Vickers to operate went into his official report. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel something approaching hope, because one pilot who'd been drowning was now breathing again. One toxic commander had been removed. One system of abuse had been interrupted. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was something. And in a military where good people often stayed silent because they felt powerless, sometimes something was everything. 2 months later, Captain Raina Ghostwalk Cahill reported to her new office in the Pentagon. The Inspector General's team welcomed her with the kind of respect that came from reading her file, from understanding what she'd survived. They gave her a desk, a phone, and access to a database containing thousands of complaints from service members across every branch. Her first case involved a helicopter pilot in South Korea being systematically excluded from training opportunities by her male peers. Raina read the complaint, saw the familiar patterns, and made the call. Within 3 days, she was on a plane to Asan Air Base, carrying fake credentials for a maintenance officer, ready to observe the situation firsthand. Because that's what General Harlow had taught her. Sometimes the only way to see the truth was to strip away the rank and protocol, to walk among the people who lived the problems every day. As the plane descended toward Seoul, Raina thought about that night in the mess hall, eating alone, wondering if anyone saw what was happening. She thought about Private Rivera, whose 3 words had changed everything. She thought about the sky over Syria and the missions that had pushed her to the edge of breaking. And she thought about all the other pilots, soldiers, sailors, and Marines who were sitting alone in mess halls right now, wondering if anyone would ever notice. Her job was to make sure someone did. The plane touched down smooth and gentle, and Captain Raina Ghostwalk Cahill gathered her bag, checked her credentials one last time, and prepared to disappear into another base, another crisis, another chance to interrupt the cycle of abuse that had nearly destroyed her. Behind her, the sky was clear and infinite. Ahead, there was work to do.